In the harsh winter of Saxon England, where bitter winds howl like wolves across the frozen marshlands, fate weaves an unlikely tale. A young mother's desperate cries pierce the darkness, abandoned by her own people, clutching her infant close as death's icy fingers reach for them both. But destiny, that ancient weaver of lives, has other plans. Through the swirling snow emerges not a Saxon savior, but a Viking warrior, one of the very raiders her people have learned to fear. His weathered face, carved by battles and northern seas, softens at the sight of mother and child. In his heart, hardened by years of warfare, something ancient and human stirs to life. What mysterious force could bind together these souls from warring worlds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ethelflaed's fingers traced the worn silver band hanging from the leather cord around her neck. The morning frost had transformed the thatch-roofed houses of the settlement into crystalline monuments, beautiful yet bitter with memory. 6 months had passed since they'd laid Edwin in the cold earth, her husband's body wrapped in linen and blessed with prayers that now seemed as hollow as the winter wind. She remembered their wedding day, when the spring sun had painted everything in hope. Edwin had been the settlement's finest carpenter, his strong hands capable of coaxing beauty from the roughest oak. Those same hands had held hers so gently as they exchanged vows before the village cross, his calloused fingers trembling slightly as he slipped the silver band onto her finger. Now she wore 2 rings, her own and his, their quiet chiming against each other, a constant reminder of what she'd lost. The early morning darkness pressed against the shutters of her small home as she stoked the dying embers, careful not to wake her son. Little Edwin, named for his father, slept peacefully in his cradle, unaware of the growing tensions that threatened their place in the community. The pregnancy had been difficult, coming late in their marriage, when hope had nearly abandoned them. Edwin had been overjoyed, already planning the toys he would carve for their child. But fate had other plans. The raid that took him came without warning. Not Vikings this time, but Welsh raiders from the western hills. Edwin had died defending the settlement's grain stores, ensuring his people's survival through the coming winter. A hero's death, they'd called it. But heroes' widows still had to eat, and heroes' children still needed warmth. She lifted little Edwin from his cradle as he stirred, his face still bearing the peaceful softness of sleep. He had his father's eyes, deep brown like rich soil, and the same gentle spirit that seemed to calm those around him. Yet these gifts that should have endeared him to the settlement had somehow marked them both as different, suspicious. The whispers had started slowly, like autumn leaves gathering in corners. Some said it was unnatural, how quiet the babe was, how he rarely cried even when hungry. Others spoke of Edwin's death, suggesting darker reasons why raiders had targeted the grain stores he guarded. The old ways still held strong in these borderlands, and misfortune bred suspicion as surely as damp bred mold. Ethelflaed wrapped her son more tightly in his woolen blanket, her mother's handiwork from what felt like a lifetime ago. Through the thin walls, she could hear the settlement stirring to life. The metallic ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the bleating of sheep being led to winter pastures, the low murmur of voices discussing matters she was no longer invited to hear. She had tried to maintain her place, offering her skills as a healer, learned at her mother's knee, but even this had turned against her. When Aldwyn's youngest recovered from fever after her poultice, some whispered of witchcraft rather than herbcraft. When old Bertha's joints eased after her willowbark tea, stories spread of dark bargains and older gods. The silver rings clinked together as she moved about the small house, preparing for another day of polite avoidance and careful isolation. Her stores were running low, the portion allotted to a widow and child stretched thin even before winter properly arrived. She had offered to work in the fields during harvest, but the alderman's wife had stepped in, speaking soft words about propriety and a widow's place. Little Edwin stirred against her chest, his tiny fingers curling around a lock of her hair. He was growing well despite everything, strong and alert, even as their circumstances grew more precarious. She hummed softly, an old lullaby her mother had sung, its words half remembered, but its comfort unchanged by time. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention, heavy boots crunching on frosted ground, multiple sets moving with purpose. Her heart quickened. No one had visited their home since the harvest festival, when she'd been pointedly uninvited, but still left bread at every door, clinging to tradition like a lifeline. The knock, when it came, was neither gentle nor uncertain. It spoke of decisions already made, of minds long since closed. Ethelflaed held her son closer, feeling the warmth of his small body against her heart. Whatever came through that door, she would face it as she had faced everything since Edwin's death, with quiet strength and the fierce love of a mother protecting her child. The rings at her neck chimed once more, a sound like distant bells, calling the faithful to prayer. But the gods, old or new, seemed very far away on this cold morning, as the door opened to reveal the alderman's grim face and the judgment that would change their lives forever. The wooden cross that had hung above. Her doorway for 15 years lay broken on the packed earth floor. Alderman Oswald's boot had knocked it down as he shouldered his way inside, and none of the 6 men who entered with him bothered to acknowledge its fall. The sharp crack of splintering wood seemed to echo in the small space, drowning out even little Edwin's startled whimper. "The council has met," Oswald announced, his voice carrying the weight of stone. Behind him, faces she had known since childhood refused to meet her gaze. "We can no longer ignore the signs." Ethelflaed drew herself up, one hand cradling her son's head protectively against her shoulder. "What signs, Oswald? The same signs that made you welcome my healing when your wife struggled with the twins' birth." A muscle twitched in the alderman's jaw. His wife had survived that night, along with both babes, though the credit had gone to prayer rather than Ethelflaed's knowledge of birthwort and raspberry leaf. "That was before," he said, "before the crops failed in the north field. Before the wolves grew bold enough to take 3 sheep in broad daylight. Before you needed someone to blame," she finished quietly. "As you blamed the miller's widow last spring until she fled to her sister's settlement." Murmurs rippled through the men. The miller's widow had indeed fled, and her abandoned mill now stood as a silent accusation of their judgment. But fear, once rooted, grows like bindweed, strangling reason and compassion alike. "You have until sunset," Oswald declared. "Take what you can carry. The rest will be burned, to cleanse." He faltered, perhaps hearing how his words echoed those of his own grandfather, who had driven out the last remnants of the old beliefs with fire and iron. "To cleanse what?" Ethelflaed's voice cut through the silence. "The memory of how your son lived because of my mother's knowledge of herbs? The shame of how my husband died protecting your grain stores?" The broken cross caught her eye, its rough-hewn arms speaking of Edwin's craftsmanship. He had carved it from oak, linking old skills to new faith, as their people had done for generations. Now it lay broken, like so many other bonds. "You know the stories," one of the younger men spoke up, emboldened by Oswald's authority. "Children who don't cry, women who speak to plants, the old magics, she laughed, though there was no mirth in it. "Like the magic of knowing which herbs ease pain, like the wisdom of generations of mothers passed down to help birth babies and heal wounds." Little Edwin stirred against her, and she gentled her voice. "The only magic here is ignorance, turning neighbors into monsters." But she could see in their faces that words were useless now. Fear had done its work, transforming the familiar into the foreign, the trusted into the threatening. Even old Willem, who had bounced little Edwin on his knee not 3 months past, now clutched a crude charm against evil. "Sunset," Oswald repeated, already turning away. "After that we cannot guarantee your safety." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear as winter frost. They left her standing in her doorway, the broken cross at her feet. Through the thin morning mist, she could see women hurrying their children indoors, pulling shutters closed against the sight of her. The same women who had stood with her at Edwin's burial, who had brought bread and sympathy in those first dark days. Little Edwin's hand found the rings at her neck, tugging gently at the leather cord. The silver bands chimed together, a sweeter sound than the muttered prayers now rising from the church where she had been baptized, married and widowed. She had, until sunset, time enough to gather what could be carried, what could not be burned. Seeds from her herb garden, dried and wrapped in careful bundles, the blanket her mother had woven, Edwin's best woodworking tools, too valuable to leave for destruction, and most precious, the small book of healing lore, its pages stuffed with dried specimens and generations of careful notes. The broken cross she lifted last, running her fingers over the splintered wood. Not everything broken was destroyed, she reminded herself. Sometimes breaking simply revealed new paths, new possibilities, like the ancient standing stones half buried in the forest, their original purpose forgotten, but their presence still, marking ways forward. Sunset approached with the inevitability of tide, painting the thatch roofs in false fire. Soon enough, real flames would rise here. But she would be gone by then, carrying with her something they could not burn: knowledge, heritage, and the quiet strength of a mother's love. The tiny woolen cap in Ethelflaed's hands bore her people's finest patterns, lovingly stitched by women who now feared her. She pulled it snug over little Edwin's head, tucking it carefully around his ears as the wind howled through the abandoned shepherd's hut they'd found as darkness fell. The stone walls, half tumbled and thick with moss, offered meager shelter from the bitter night, but it was better than nothing. "Hush now, little one," she whispered, though her son hadn't made a sound. That unnatural quietness, once a blessing that had allowed her to gather herbs while he slept peacefully in a sling, had become part of their undoing. She touched the cap's embroidered edge, tracing the pattern of protection her mother had sewn into it, crosses and older symbols intertwined, as inseparable as the blood in their veins. The first snow of winter was falling, each flake carrying winter's curse. In summer, a woman and child alone might survive on wild berries and roots, on the abundance of nature's careless mercy. But winter was a hungry wolf that devoured the weak and unwary. She had managed to bring more than expected: a small sack of dried meat and hard bread, Edwin's tools wrapped in oilcloth, her precious book of remedies, and the herbs she'd gathered through the growing season. The weight of the provisions had left deep marks on her shoulders, but she'd gladly bear worse to keep her son alive. Little Edwin nuzzled against her breast, seeking warmth and comfort. She opened her cloak, wrapping it around them both as she nursed him. The last light of day painted the snow-laden clouds in shades of bruised purple, while shadows crept closer like guilty thoughts. "Your father built shelter from less than this," she told her son, her voice barely a whisper above the wind's moan. The shepherd's hut had collapsed years ago, but some of its timbers might still be sound enough to fashion a windbreak. Edwin had taught her which woods stayed true, how to test their strength with blade and thumb. The darkness deepened, and with it came the sounds of night. The hunting cry of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the frozen undergrowth, and something larger moving through the trees beyond their shelter. Wolves had grown bold in recent years, driven by harsh winters and failing hunts to venture closer to human settlements. She reached for Edwin's woodworking knife, its familiar weight offering cold comfort. The blade would serve against wolves, if it came to that, but against the deeper cold, against hunger and exhaustion, against the creeping despair that threatened to freeze her heart more surely than any winter storm. The night pressed closer, and she found herself humming, not the Christian hymns of her adult years, but older songs. Songs her grandmother had sung when the world grew dark and spirits walked abroad. Songs of survival, of endurance, of the ancient powers that watched over mothers and children. Little Edwin's breathing deepened into sleep, trusting absolutely in her protection. She adjusted his cap again, her fingers lingering on the stitched patterns. Her mother had sewn it during her pregnancy, working by candlelight through long winter evenings. "A child's first cap is their shield against winter's teeth," she'd said. threading her needle with wool dyed in colors that held meaning: red for life's blood, blue for heaven's protection, white for the ancestors' guidance. Now, as bitter wind found every gap in the ancient stones, Ethelflaed prayed to anything that might listen, to the Christian God of her husband's faith, to the older powers her grandmother had honored, to the very stones that had sheltered shepherds since before the Romans came. The snow fell thicker, beginning to drift against the hut's remaining walls. By morning they might be trapped or saved. Snow could insulate as well as freeze, her mother's teachings reminded her. But first, they had to survive the night. To maintain that precious warmth that separated life from the endless cold. She pressed her lips to her son's forehead, feeling the steady warmth of him. The cap's embroidered patterns pressed against her cheek, and she imagined she could feel the prayers woven into every stitch, the love and hope and fear that had guided her mother's needle. They were not the first to face winter's judgment, nor would they be the last. But they were alive, and while life remained, hope might yet bloom even in the deepest cold. The night crept on, and Ethelflaed kept vigil, one hand on her sleeping child, the other on Edwin's knife, watching the darkness for wolves both real and metaphorical as the snow continued to fall. Bjorn Ravenson's calloused fingers closed around, the silver raven pendant at his throat as the storm winds howled across the heath. 20 winters of raiding had taught him to read Odin's signs, and everything, from the way the shadows lengthened to how the snowflakes danced on the wind, spoke of changes to come. The pendant, black with age except where his thumb had worn, its silver bright, had been his father's last gift before the fever took him. The main raiding party had turned north 2 days ago, heavy with plunder from the southern settlements, but something had called Bjorn eastward, a nagging touch of weird that even mead couldn't drown. The raven pendant seemed heavier than usual, pulling him toward the marshlands, where few dared to venture in winter's grip. "The old man's ravens guide us still, eh?" he muttered in Norse, watching a real raven wheel overhead through the thickening snow. Hugin or Munin, thought or memory, his mother would have known. She had been Velva, a seeress before a Saxon blade took her. The irony of following her teachings in these Saxon lands was not lost on him. His hand dropped to the sword at his side, fingers tracing the familiar patterns hammered into its hilt. The blade had drunk deep this season, but each raid felt more hollow than the last. Once the sight of Saxon settlements had stirred his blood with thoughts of glory and gold. Now he found himself watching the faces of those they conquered, seeing something his younger self had missed. The raven above called again, its harsh cry cutting through the storm's moan. Bjorn's small crew, just 4 loyal men who'd followed him on this fool's errand, huddled near their makeshift shelter, looking at him with poorly concealed concern. They'd followed him through a dozen raids, trusted his instincts when larger parties called him overcautious. But this following, a bird's flight into freezing marshland. "Thorvald," he called to his second, a bear of a man with a frost-colored beard. "Keep the men close to shelter. This storm has Odin's teeth in it. And you, Ravenson?" Thorvald's voice carried the weight of long friendship. "Will you finally tell us what we're seeking in this cursed place?" Bjorn's fingers found the raven. Pendant again. How could he explain what he himself didn't understand? The dreams that had plagued him since they'd burned that last settlement, not of battle glory or feasting halls, but of something else. A cry in the darkness, a thread of weird pulling taut. "The gods don't always show us the path," he said finally. "Only the next step." Words his mother had spoken often, usually before revealing something that changed everything. The wind shifted, carrying with it a sound so faint he might have imagined it, but the raven pendant grew warm against his skin, and the bird overhead banked sharply toward the east. "Keep the fires burning," he told Thorvald. "If I'm not back by moonrise." He let the words trail off. They both knew the dangers of these marshlands, how the mists could turn a man around until he walked into drowning pools. "Your father's raven leading you again?" Thorvald asked quietly, eyeing the pendant. They'd been boys together, had seen the old man's uncanny way of finding what was hidden, of knowing where to raid. and where to show mercy. Something's calling, Bjorn admitted, something important. The bigger man nodded slowly. The men whisper that you've lost your taste for raiding, that the old ways speak louder to you now than gold or glory. And, what do you say, old friend? Thorvald's hand came to rest on his shoulder, heavy as winter furs. I say that Odin's ravens flew before we raised sword or axe, and their wisdom runs deeper than our small feuds. The wind carried that sound again, clearer now, a cry that spoke of desperation and defiance both. The raven pendant pulsed warm against his skin, and overhead the bird called once more before disappearing into the swirling snow. Bjorn checked his weapons one last time. Sword, axe, the small knife at his belt. Tools of death, yes, but also of life, for cutting wood, building shelter, surviving. His mother's voice seemed to whisper from the storm. Sometimes we must walk away from what we know to find what we need. With a last nod to Thorvald, he turned east, following the raven's flight into the gathering dark. The storm wrapped around him like a lover's embrace, and somewhere ahead, that cry echoed again, carrying a note that tugged at something long, buried in his warrior's heart. The old bear fur cloak had seen Bjorn through 9 winters of raiding, its weight familiar as armor across his shoulders. Now, as he approached the crumbling shepherd's hut, that same cloak seemed to whisper of different purposes. The woman's cry had fallen silent, but the raven still circled overhead, a dark shadow against the storm-white sky. He saw her before she saw him, a figure half buried in shadow, curved protectively around something small. Her head snapped up at his approach, and he recognized the look in her eyes, not just fear, but the fierce determination of one who had already lost too much to surrender easily. "Stay back!" Her Saxon tongue was clear, despite her chattering teeth. One hand clutched, a woodworker's knife, its blade catching what little light remained. Bjorn raised his empty hands slowly, deliberately. The raven pendant felt warm against his chest, though the wind cut like ice shards through the gaps in his mail. "No harm," he said in halting Saxon, words learned from traders and thralls. "No harm to mother and child." Her eyes widened at his voice, Norse accented but careful. The bundle against her breast stirred, and Bjorn caught a glimpse of the infant's face, dusted with snowflakes that refused to melt. The cold was taking them, slowly but surely. Without thinking, he unclasped his cloak. The wind immediately bit, deeper, but he barely felt it. He held the heavy fur out like an offering, moving with the careful slowness one might use to approach a wounded deer. "You are freezing," he said, struggling with the Saxon words. "Child will die." The knife didn't waver, but something shifted in her gaze. Why would a Northman help a Saxon? Her words carried the weight of every raid, every burning village, every widowed woman. Bjorn's fingers found his raven pendant. "Ravens led," he said simply. Then, searching for better words, "Gods have purposes we do not see." A bitter laugh escaped her. "The Christian God cast us out. Why should Norse gods care? All gods protect mothers and children." His mother's teachings again, wisdom that transcended the boundaries of belief. Or should. The infant made a tiny sound, not quite a cry, but a whisper of distress that seemed to pierce the storm itself. The woman's resolve wavered, her eyes darting between Bjorn's face, his outstretched cloak, and the darkness beyond where the temperature continued to plummet. Moving slowly, telegraphing each motion, Bjorn laid the cloak on the frozen ground. Between them. Then he stepped back, giving her space to choose. She studied him for a long moment, her face sharp with intelligence despite her exhaustion. "You're alone," she observed. "No warband." He shook his head. "Near, but will not come unless called." Her knife lowered a fraction. "I know your kind. I've healed the wounds your raiders leave. Why should I trust you?" "Because you die otherwise," he said bluntly. "Both of you." The truth of it hung between them like frost in the air. The storm was worsening, and the shepherd's hut offered scant protection. Even if she survived the night, the morning would bring wolves, both four-legged and two-legged, drawn by weakness and opportunity. The infant stirred again, and something shifted in the woman's face. Slowly, watching him like a hawk, she reached for the cloak with her free hand. The fur was still warm from his body as she pulled it around herself and the child. "I am called Ethelflaed," she said finally, her voice carrying both pride and caution. "Bjorn Ravenson," he replied, touching his pendant. As if in answer, the raven overhead called once before banking away into the storm. "Your bird seems certain," she said, a hint of dry humor crossing her face. "Odin's bird," he corrected. "I only follow." The wind howled louder, driving snow through the hut's broken walls. The child burrowed deeper into the shared warmth of cloak and mother, and Bjorn saw Ethelflaed's arms tighten protectively. "There is shelter," he said carefully. "Warm fires, food." He paused, choosing his words. "Choice is yours, but storm comes harder now." She looked down at her son, then at the knife still in her hand. Finally, her eyes met Bjorn's, measuring him with a gaze that seemed to cut through flesh to bone and spirit. "If you betray this trust," she said quietly, "neither your gods nor mine will protect you." Bjorn nodded, recognizing the oath in her words. "On my mother's grave," he replied in Norse, then in Saxon, "I swear it." The shared cloak billowed between them as Ethelflaed rose, her son cradled close, the knife disappearing somewhere in her clothes. Together, they turned east, toward the promise of warmth and the uncertainty of trust newly born. The ancient war horn at Bjorn's belt had once heralded death and terror across Saxon shores. Now, as they picked their way through the deepening snow, its purpose had changed. Every hour he would lift it to his lips and sound two short, clear notes, a signal to Thorvald's group that all was well, that no pursuit had found them. Ethelflaed watched him each time he sounded it, her face a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Her son, bundled against her chest in both his woolen cap and Bjorn's great cloak, had finally fallen into proper sleep, his tiny fingers curled around one of the silver rings at his mother's neck. "Your men," she said during one of their brief rests, "they will accept this? A Saxon woman and child?" Bjorn's hand dropped to the horn as he considered his answer. The carved bone was smooth with age, its surface etched with running wolves and twisting serpents. "They follow me," he said finally, "and I follow the ravens." He touched his pendant meaningfully. The snow had begun to ease, but the wind still bit deep. Ethelflaed adjusted the cloak, and Bjorn noticed how she kept one hand free, never far from her hidden knife. Smart woman. Trust, like spring thaw, came slowly. "The horn," she said suddenly. "I remember its sound, 3 summers ago, when the raids came to the southern shores." Bjorn nodded slowly. "Different times," he said. "Different purposes." He lifted the horn, studying its carvings. "My father said, a horn can call to war or call to feast. The breath that fills it decides." A ghost of a smile touched Ethelflaed's lips. "Your Saxon is improving." "My mother taught healer's wisdom," he replied. "Said words can wound or heal. Like herbs, must choose carefully." They pressed on through the whitened landscape. Bjorn led them on a winding path, avoiding the deeper drifts where a woman carrying a child might struggle. He found himself watching her movements, noting how she tested each step before committing her weight, how she used the terrain to shelter from the wind. She had wilderness craft, this Saxon widow. The baby stirred once, making that strange, almost silent sound that seemed to echo in Bjorn's chest. Ethelflaed immediately began humming, a tune that caught at Bjorn's memory. "I know this song," he said, surprised. "My mother." "The cradle song?" Ethelflaed's eyes widened slightly. "It's very old. My grandmother said it came from the north, before the Christians." Bjorn lifted the horn again, but this time he played a different pattern, 3 notes, rising like a question. In the distance, Thorvald's answering call came clear and strong. They were keeping pace. "Your child," Bjorn said carefully. "He's very quiet, like he listens to older songs." Ethelflaed's step faltered slightly. "That's what they said in the settlement, that it wasn't natural, that he was touched by." She trailed off. "The old powers?" Bjorn's hand went to his pendant. My mother said some children are born with raven's wisdom. They see more, cry less. The baby chose that moment to look directly at Bjorn, and something in those deep brown eyes seemed to reach right through his warrior's armor. Without thinking, he found himself humming the cradle song, his deep voice harmonizing with Ethelflaed's lighter tone. For a moment, just a moment, the wind seemed to soften around them, as if the ancient melody had called up some forgotten protection. Even the ravens overhead flew closer, their wings dark against the pearl-grey sky. "How far?" Ethelflaed asked, her voice practical again, though something had shifted in her stance. The hand that had stayed near her knife now rested more easily against her son. Bjorn lifted the horn one last time, listening to how its call echoed back from the hidden landscape. "Before darkness," he said, "Thorvald keeps good fires." They walked on in comfortable silence, their footprints marking a strange path through the snow, Norse warrior and Saxon healer, following Raven's guidance toward an uncertain future. Every so often the horn would sound its gentle warning, "We are here, we are safe, we are coming home." And if that home was no longer the burning and plunder of his youth, but something older and deeper that his mother might have recognized, well, that was a mystery for the ravens to unravel, one step at a time, through the winter-touched world. The arrow struck the tree beside them with a dull thud, its ash shaft quivering in the frozen bark. Bjorn reached for it, recognizing the distinctive fletching, goose feathers dyed Saxon blue, marked with the red stripe of a pursuit party. They'd been found sooner than he'd expected. "Your people?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Ethelflaed's face had gone rigid, her arms tightening around her sleeping son. "The alderman's hunters," she whispered. "They're not supposed to—" She swallowed hard. "They were meant to let us go." Bjorn broke the arrow shaft with one hand, studying the splintered wood. "Not all men keep their word when pride is wounded." He touched his raven pendant, noting how the birds overhead had gone silent. "How many hunters?" "4, maybe 5. Willem leads them in winter." Her voice caught. "He used to bring us honey from his hives." The wind shifted, carrying with it the crack of branches under heavy boots. They were being flanked, herded like deer toward the marsh's edge. Bjorn's hand moved to his sword, but Ethelflaed caught his wrist. "No blood," she said firmly. "Not for my sake. They're foolish, frightened men." "Frightened men kill quickest," Bjorn countered, but he left the sword sheathed. Instead, he pulled the horn from his belt, sounding 3 sharp blasts that echoed across the snow-laden trees. Thorvald would understand. The baby stirred, making that otherworldly, almost silence that seemed to hang in the air like frost. In the distance, a twig snapped. Closer now. They were running out of time. "Trust me?" Bjorn asked, switching to his native Norse so the pursuers wouldn't understand. Ethelflaed studied his face for a long moment, then nodded once, decisively. "Yes." Moving swiftly, Bjorn unwound a length of rope from his pack. With practiced hands, he fashioned a simple harness, helping Ethelflaed secure her son more firmly against her chest, leaving her arms free. The broken arrow he tucked into his belt, a reminder of promises broken and bridges burned. "When I call the ravens," he said in Saxon, loud enough to carry, "run north. Do not look back." Her eyes widened slightly at his words, but she gave no other sign of surprise. The hunters were visible now through the trees, 4 men with drawn bows, Willem's greying head in the lead. Their faces were grim beneath their hoods, but their hands shook slightly on their weapons. Not killers then, at least not yet. "Ethelflaed!" Willem's voice cracked with age and emotion. "Give up this madness. Return to the settlement. The alderman will show mercy. Like the mercy you showed when you burned my herbs," her voice rang clear across the snow, "or when you called my son demon-touched." Another arrow flew, this one falling short, its blue fletching stark against the white ground. The hunters were spreading out, trying to cut off their escape to the north, but they hadn't counted on what waited in that direction. Bjorn raised his hands slowly, deliberately drawing their attention. Then he threw back his head and called out in his deepest voice, not words, but the harsh cry of a raven, amplified by years of practice at his mother's knee. The response was immediate. Dark wings exploded from the trees around them as every raven in earshot took flight at once, a storm of black feathers and raucous calls that filled the air like smoke. The hunters stumbled back, arrows going wide as they tried to track threats from all directions. "Now!" Bjorn grabbed Ethelflaed's, and they ran. Through the confusion of wings and snow, past the startled hunters, toward the promise of Thorvald's waiting fires. Behind them, Willem's voice rose in frustration, but no more arrows followed. They ran until Ethelflaed's breath came in gasps, until the baby's weight began to pull at her shoulders. Only then did Bjorn slow them to a walk, his hand still wrapped protectively around hers. "The ravens," she said when she could speak again. "How did you—" "My mother's art," he replied. She said, "Ravens remember who honors them. They are wise birds, older than our quarrels." Ethelflaed looked back the way they'd come, where the broken arrow still rode in Bjorn's belt. "They won't stop hunting," she said softly. "Not until they believe their fear is laid to rest." Bjorn touched his pendant, feeling its familiar warmth. "Then we give them something new to fear," he said. "Something older than their young gods. Something that protects its own." The baby made his. Almost silent sound again, and overhead the ravens called in answer. Ethelflaed's hand tightened in Bjorn's as they walked north, leaving the hunters and their broken arrows behind, following the dark wings toward sanctuary. The wooden bowl passed from hand to hand around the Viking's fire was older than any who sat there. Its rim was worn smooth by generations of lips, its surface darkened by countless meals, shared in victory and defeat. When it reached Ethelflaed, the camp fell silent, every eye watching to see if she would drink. The mead inside caught the firelight like liquid amber. Her fingers traced the bowl's carved edges, patterns she recognized from ancient stones, spirals that spoke of continuity and return. Bjorn sat beside her, his presence both guard and guide, while little Edwin slept peacefully in a nest of furs provided by Thorvald's wife, Sigrid. "In our way," Bjorn said quietly in his improving Saxon, "to share the bowl is to share fate." Ethelflaed lifted the bowl, feeling its weight. "And if fate is cruel, then we face it together," came Sigrid's unexpected reply in careful Saxon. The older woman's face was lined with weather and wisdom, her grey-streaked hair bound in intricate braids that marked her as both wife and vulva. The camp was smaller than Ethelflaed had imagined, just 3 longships' worth of warriors and their families, who had chosen to winter on English shores rather than risk the late-season journey home. Their shelters were well built, a mixture of tents and temporary wooden structures that spoke of skill and experience in surviving hostile lands. She raised the bowl to her lips and drank. The mead was different from what she knew, darker, richer, tasting of herbs she couldn't name. As she lowered the bowl, Sigrid nodded in approval, and something in the camp's atmosphere shifted subtly. "The Saxon woman drinks as a North woman," observed one of the older warriors, his beard frosted with age and snow. "Perhaps Odin's ravens knew what they were about, eh, Ravenson?" Bjorn's hand moved to his pendant. "The ravens see what we miss, Grimolf, like how a Saxon healer might strengthen our camp before the deep winter comes." Murmurs rippled around the fire. Ethelflaed felt the weight of calculation in their gazes, not hostility now, but assessment. These were practical people who had survived by recognizing value where they found it. Little Edwin stirred in his furs, making his almost silent sound. To Ethelflaed's surprise, Sigrid smiled. "A raven's child," she said softly. "My grandmother spoke of such babies. They hear the old songs in their sleep." "Some called it unnatural," Ethelflaed said carefully, passing the bowl to the next person in the circle. "Some fear what they don't understand," Sigrid replied. "But we remember, the quiet ones often see clearest." She reached into her belt pouch and drew out a handful of dried herbs. "You know these?" Ethelflaed studied the leaves, her healers, knowledge rising to the surface. "Feverfew," she said, "but prepared differently than I've seen." "Northern ways," Sigrid nodded. "Perhaps we can teach each other, yes? Winter is long, and knowledge waits nothing in the bearing." the bowl completed. Its circuit around the fire, each drink a small pledge, each passing a quiet acceptance. Ethelflaed felt something long knotted in her chest begin to loosen. Here, at least, her son's quietness was seen as a gift rather than a curse. "Rest now," Bjorn said, as the gathering began to disperse. "Tomorrow we strengthen the shelters against the deep cold. Your knowledge of Saxon winter plants may save lives before spring comes." Ethelflaed looked around the camp, at Sigrid, sorting her herbs, at the warrior Grimolf, showing a young boy how to check bowstrings for ice damage, at Thorvald banking the fire for the night. Different faces, different tongues, but the same human concerns she'd known all her life: survival, community, the passing of knowledge from hand to hand, as smoothly worn as the old wooden bowl that had welcomed her to this new world. The tiny wooden boat, taking shape under Bjorn's knife, bore none of the fierce dragon heads or snarling wolves of his people's war vessels. Instead, its prow curved gently like a swan's neck, its sides smooth and simple enough for small hands to grasp. He worked on it during the quiet hours before dawn, when the camp still slept and only the watchfires marked the boundary between earth and sky. "Your father's skill lives in your hands," Ethelflaed said softly, approaching with 2 steaming cups of Sigrid's herb tea. 3 weeks in the camp had smoothed some of the wariness from her movements, though she still carried herself with the alertness of one who had learned survival's harder lessons. Bjorn accepted the cup, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and something sweeter, Saxon meadow sweet, he'd learned to recognize. "Edwin was a woodworker, yes? Your husband, the finest in our settlement." She settled beside him on the fallen log he'd claimed as a workbench, close enough to share warmth but not quite touching. "He would have liked your design, simple but true." The wood shavings at their feet caught the early light like scattered snow. Little Edwin slept nearby in the shelter Bjorn had helped build, a curious blend of Norse efficiency and Saxon comfort. Like the child himself, it bridged 2 worlds without fully belonging to either. "In our stories," Bjorn said, working his knife along a delicate curve, "boats carry more than just people and goods. They carry dreams, fates, the souls of those, passing between worlds." He paused, choosing his words carefully in their developing shared language. "A child's first toy boat, it opens paths, shows possibilities." Ethelflaed's fingers brushed the silver rings at her neck, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her way of touching memories. Edwin had started carving him a horse, said every Saxon boy should learn to ride early. She smiled faintly. "But perhaps this one will learn to sail first." The baby stirred, making his almost silent sound that no longer seemed strange to anyone in the camp. Sigrid had taken to calling him Little Raven, and the name was catching on even among the warriors who had initially kept their distance. "He grows stronger," Bjorn observed, setting aside his knife to smooth the boat's hull with a scrap of leather. "Like his mother." A flush of color touched Ethelflaed's cheeks, visible even in the dim light. "We both grow stronger. Your people." She hesitated. "They are not what the Saxon stories told us, nor are you what our raids taught us." Bjorn reached for his tools again, but his hand brushed hers, reaching for the same piece of leather. Neither pulled away immediately. "Sigrid says I have a gift for the northern healing ways," she said after a moment. "Something about how the plants speak differently here, closer to the old powers." Bjorn nodded. He'd seen her working with Sigrid, combining Saxon herb lore with Norse traditions. Their healing tent had become a place where both peoples came, for aid, pain, and injury, caring little for the boundaries of culture. "The old powers," he said, "they remember when these lands were one. Before Rome, before Saxon, before Viking. Perhaps they grow tired of our divisions. Like the ravens?" There was a hint of teasing in her voice now, something that had been emerging gradually, like spring from winter's grip. "Like the ravens," he agreed, touching his pendant, "who see more clearly than we do." The camp was stirring to life around them, voices calling in Norse and broken Saxon, the clatter of cooking pots, the ring of the smith's hammer where Grimolf worked on repairing a broken axe head. A world of mixed tongues and shared purpose. Little Edwin woke fully then, his almost silent morning greeting drawing both their attention. Bjorn handed Ethelflaed the nearly finished boat. "For testing," he said. "If he grips it well, I will smooth it more. If not—" He shrugged. "A boat must fit the hand that holds it." She turned the toy carefully, fingers finding the places where Norse knotwork subtly merged with Saxon patterns along its sides. "You've woven both our ways into it, as we are all woven," he said simply. "The Norns spin fate's threads together, not apart." The rising sun caught the silver rings at her neck, Edwin's last gift now hanging beside a small raven pendant, Sigrid's welcome gift given the night she'd first shared the bowl. Different symbols, different stories, beginning to weave a new pattern. Bjorn returned to his carving as Ethelflaed went to tend their son. The wood beneath his hands held possibilities he was only beginning to understand, like the paths that opened when one dared to sail beyond the known shores of the heart. The blood-stained shield propped against the meeting tent's center pole bore the marks of both old victories and fresh conflict. Its surface told the story of its owner, Guthrum Blacktooth, whose reputation for ruthlessness had spread from the northern fjords to the Saxon shores. 3 ships had appeared on the horizon at dawn, their dragon heads darker than storm clouds. Against the winter sky. "They say you harbor a Saxon witch," Guthrum's voice carried across the gathering, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. "That Bjorn Ravenson has grown soft, bewitched by foreign magic and a pretty face." Bjorn stood at the tent's edge, one hand resting on his sword hilt, the other touching his raven pendant. Behind him, he could sense Ethelflaed's presence in the shelter, where she kept silent watch with Sigrid over the sleeping child. "We harbor a healer," he replied evenly, "whose knowledge has kept 3 of our warriors alive through fever time. The old ways teach us to value wisdom wherever it blooms." A rumble of agreement came from his own people. They had seen Ethelflaed work alongside Sigrid, combining Saxon herbs with Norse methods to fight the winter sickness that had threatened their camp. But Guthrum's men exchanged dark looks, hands straying to weapons. "The old ways," Guthrum spat into the central fire. "The old ways demand blood for blood. How many of our brothers have Saxon spears killed? How many of our ships have their treachery burned? And how many of their villages have we burned?" Thorvald spoke up, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "How many of their children have we orphaned? The old ways also speak of honor, of wisdom in knowing when to lower the sword." Guthrum's shield arm bore a fresh wound, hastily bound. His crew had clearly faced recent battle, perhaps, with Saxon defenders further south. The failure of their raid showed in their hollow cheeks and hungry eyes. "Honor?" Guthrum laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Is that what you call splitting your loyalties between our gods and Saxon weakness? The ravens led you, you say?" He gestured contemptuously at Bjorn's pendant. "Perhaps they led you to madness." The shield seemed to pulse in the firelight, its bloodstains like accusations. Bjorn felt the weight of both camps watching him, waiting to see how he would answer this challenge to everything they'd built over the past months. "I have sailed with you, Guthrum," he said quietly, "fought beside you in the eastern raids. You know my sword arm hasn't weakened, but strength isn't only in the blade. Sometimes it's in knowing when to bind wounds instead of making them." "Pretty words," Guthrum sneered. "Did your Saxon teach them to you, along with her Christian prayers?" "She teaches what your wounded arm needs now," Bjorn replied, noting how the older warrior favored his shield side. "The fever bark that saved Grimolf's life last week, the same healing that could save your men from the sickness I can smell on their breath." A stir went through Guthrum's crew. They had been coughing, Bjorn realized, trying to hide it, but failing. The same winter fever that had nearly claimed their own warriors now threatened these newcomers. "We need no Saxon healing," Guthrum growled, but his voice held less conviction. "Then why did you really come?" Sigrid's voice cut through the tension as she emerged from the shadows. "The ravens don't speak of your true purpose, Guthrum Blacktooth, but the winds do. You didn't come to fight. You came because you heard we had a healer strong enough to fight winter's teeth." The old Vulva's words struck home. Several of Guthrum's men coughed openly now, their faces flushed with more than just the cold. Their leader's shield arm trembled slightly, the wound's infection evident in his two bright eyes. A healer's oath knows no sides. Aethelflaed's voice came clear and strong as she stepped into the firelight. Little Edwin was secure in his sling across her chest, watching the proceedings with his uncanny calm. Your arm festers, Guthrum Blacktooth. Another day, and it will reach your heart. The warrior's face contorted, pride warring with desperation. The blood-stained shield slipped slightly in his weakening grip. You would heal those who would kill you? He demanded. I heal those who need healing, she replied simply. As my gods teach, and as your vulva understands, the choice is yours. Hold. Do your hate and die, or let us show you a different kind of strength. The shield's shadow wavered on the tent wall, like a prophecy awaiting fulfillment. Its battle scars a testament to old ways, giving way to new. In the silence that followed, even the ravens held their breath. The healing herbs bundle hanging from the tent pole combined Saxon wisdom with Norse tradition. Feverfew and willow bark bound with red thread in the pattern Sigrid called Odin's knot. Below it lay Guthrum Blacktooth, his proud frame humbled by fever, while Aethelflaed pressed a poultice against his infected wound. Your hands are gentle for a Saxon, he muttered, half delirious with fever. The stories said your kind had claws beneath their skin, and our stories said Vikings had ice in their veins instead of blood, she replied calmly, checking the heat of his skin with practiced fingers. Stories rarely survive meeting their subjects face to face. Bjorn watched from the tent's entrance, where he'd kept vigil through the night. 3 of Guthrum's men had already fallen to the fever, their bodies burning like forge fire despite the winter's cold. But none had died, not yet, not while Aethelflaed worked her healing arts under Sigrid's approving eye. The herbs speak clearer when bound with northern wisdom, Sigrid observed, grinding more bark for the fever tea. See how the patterns match? Saxon rose and Norse knots working together like fingers on the same hand. Outside, the two camps had begun to merge by necessity. Thorvald organized hunting parties that mixed both crews, while Grimolf taught Guthrum's youngest warriors how to check for fever signs. Survival proved a stronger force than old hatreds. Tell me true, Ravenson. Guthrum's voice was clearer now, the fever beginning to break. What did the ravens really show you that day? When you found her in the snow? Bjorn touched his pendant, remembering. They showed me what we could become, he said finally. Not just raiders and victims, but people who remember the old wisdom, that strength flows many ways, like rivers to the sea. Aethelflaed's hand stilled briefly on Guthrum's bandage. The warrior studied her face with new understanding, seeing perhaps for the first time not a Saxon witch, but a woman of skill and courage. Your boy, Guthrum said, the quiet one. He watches everything, sees more than he should, like the ravens. He sees what we all might see, Sigrid interjected, if we looked with newer eyes. She hung another herb bundle, this one mixing healing plants from both traditions. The old powers don't care what tongue prays to them, only that the prayers are true. Little Edwin, secure in his cradle of furs nearby, made his almost silent sound. To everyone's surprise, Guthrum chuckled, a rough sound, like stones rolling. Underwater. My grandmother spoke of such children, he said they were touched by the gods themselves, meant to bridge the spaces between worlds. He grimaced as Aethelflaed tightened his bandage. We feared such bridges once. Feared what might cross them. And now, Bjorn asked quietly. Guthrum's eyes moved from Aethelflaed's careful hands to the herb bundles swaying gently above him, their mixed wisdom working to save his life. Now I wonder if the fear itself wasn't the poison all along. Beyond the tent, voices rose in a curious harmony, Norse warriors learning a Saxon healing chant from one of Aethelflaed's lessons, their accents rough but earnest. The sound blended with the smoke from shared fires, carrying the scent of combined traditions, cooking in the same pots. Your wound will heal clean, Ethelflaed told Guthrum, starting to pack away her herbs. But the scar will remind you, if you let it. Remind me of what? The warrior's voice held genuine curiosity now, the fever's lesson still fresh in his blood. That healing can come from unexpected hands, she said. That strength shows itself in many ways. She smiled slightly. That even Vikings and Saxons can share wisdom if they choose to listen. Guthrum's hand moved to touch the bandage, then paused, reaching instead for the herb bundle hanging above him. These patterns, he said thoughtfully, they're like the ones on my mother's healing cloths. I had forgotten. Memory is like that, Sigrid nodded. It sleeps sometimes, waiting for the right moment to wake. She began preparing a fresh poultice for the remaining sick men. Perhaps that's what the ravens truly led us to. Not just survival, but remembering. Bjorn watched as Ethelflaed moved among the other patients, her movements sure and graceful. The herb bundles swayed gently in the winter breeze that crept through the tent flaps, their combined sense speaking of hope and healing, of old boundaries giving way to new understanding. Outside, the blood-stained shield still stood against the tent pole, but now it served a different purpose. As a backing for drying herbs, its surface slowly disappearing beneath layers of healing rather than harm. The sunstone in Bjorn's palm caught the weak winter light, its crystalline surface revealing secrets hidden from ordinary eyes. Through its depths, he could find the sun's position, even through the dense cloud cover that had followed them north for 3 days. The ancient Vikings had used such stones to navigate the trackless seas, finding their way home when all other signs failed. It's beautiful, Ethelflaed said, watching as he taught her to hold the stone at the correct angle. They stood at the ship's prow, little Edwin secured against her chest in a sling Sigrid had woven with both Saxon and Norse protective patterns. The child seemed to love the sea's motion, his almost silent sounds matching the rhythm of the waves. My mother said these stones remember when the world was young, Bjorn explained, letting her take the crystal, when the light was new and all paths were still possible. The merged crew, Bjorn's people and the surviving members of Guthrum's band, who had chosen to follow them north, worked together with growing efficiency. Even Guthrum himself, his arm healing clean thanks to Ethelflaed's care, had found a place among them, his knowledge of northern waters proving invaluable as they navigated the treacherous spring currents. There, Bjorn guided her hands with the stone. See how the light splits? That's true north, where the old powers still speak clearly. Ethelflaed's fingers trembled slightly against his as she found the angle. Like following your ravens, but through crystal instead of wings? He smiled, touching his pendant. All paths lead home eventually, some just take longer to reveal themselves. The sea air carried the promise of snow, but not yet the bitter cold that would make travel impossible. They had timed their departure well, leaving as soon as Guthrum's men had recovered enough to sail. Behind them, the Saxon shores receded into memory, carrying with them the weight of old fears and older prejudices. Tell me again about your northern home, Ethelflaed said, still holding the sunstone. She had begun asking more frequently as they drew closer, perhaps seeking to prepare herself for this new world she had chosen. The fjords are like great arms of stone, Bjorn began, falling into the rhythm of description he had developed over their weeks at sea. They reach from the mountains to embrace the water, creating harbours deeper than Saxon imagination. The forests climb the slopes like armies of green, and in summer the sun barely sets, and in winter the darkness holds its own beauty. The stars wheel overhead like scattered jewels, and the northern lights dance like spirits across the sky. He watched her face as she tried to picture it. The great hall where my people gather is built from ancient trees, each beam carved with the stories of our ancestors. But there's room for new stories too. Little Edwin stirred, reaching out a tiny hand toward the sunstone. The crystal seemed to brighten at his touch, its inner light pulsing like a heartbeat. He has the sight, Guthrum commented, approaching from his position at the steering oar. The older warrior had developed an unexpected gentleness around the child, perhaps seeing in him the bridge between worlds his grandmother had spoken of. The stones speak to those who carry the old blood. Saxon and Norse both came from the northern stars, Sigrid added, bringing them warm mead against the growing chill. Perhaps the stones remember when we were one people, before borders and beliefs drew their lines across the sea. Ethelflaed handed the sunstone back to Bjorn, but not before pressing it briefly to her son's forehead in blessing. And what lines will he draw, I wonder? Or will he erase them instead? He'll draw the lines that need drawing, Bjorn said softly, and erase those that need erasing, like the tides that shape the shore, but gentler, wiser. The ship crested a wave, sending spray across the deck. The crew worked seamlessly, Saxon hands and Norse strength moving as one to adjust the sail. From the stern, someone began singing, a Norse sailing song, but with words that blended both tongues, a new music born of necessity and transformation. Bjorn held up the sunstone one last time, confirming their course. Through its ancient clarity, he saw not just the sun's hidden face, but the future taking shape around them, a child of two worlds, a love that defied boundaries, and a path home that had required leaving everything known behind to find everything possible. The stone shows true north, he said, tucking it away safely, but the heart finds its own truth, eh? Ethelflaed's answer was to take his hand, her fingers strong and sure against his as they sailed onward, following the light that led them home. The great bearskin fur that covered their bed had its own story, one that Bjorn's people told around. Winter fires. Killed in the first snows of his youth, the bear had been massive even by northern standards, its fur so thick and dark it seemed to swallow torchlight. Now it served as both blanket and reminder that survival often meant finding warmth in what had once meant danger. Ethelflaed tucked its edges more securely around little Edwin, who slept peacefully despite the howling wind that rattled the hall's mighty beams. Outside, the winter storm had transformed the fjord into a realm of white fury, but inside the great hall, life continued with surprising warmth. "He grows stronger every day," Bjorn observed, adding wood to their section of the long hearth, like a young tree finding light through stone. Their son had taken his first steps just days ago, tottering between Saxon mother and Norse father with equal confidence, drawing cheers from both peoples. "The northern air agrees with him," Ethelflaed agreed, her Saxon accent now softened by months of speaking Norse. She had learned quickly, as she learned everything about her new home, from the ways of preserving food through the long dark, to the intricate social patterns that governed hall life. Their sleeping space, like all the others along the hall's length, was marked by carved posts that told stories. Bjorn showed his battles and voyages, while the newer post taking shape under his knife depicted different victories. A healing hand, a child's first steps, a raven in flight, their shared story carved into the heart of his people's home. "Tell me again about the bear," came a small voice from beneath the fur. Little Edwin wasn't as silent as he had once been, though his words, when they came, carried a wisdom that still gave many pause. "Ah, so you're not sleeping after all, little raven?" Bjorn laughed, settling beside them. "Well then, it was the first winter I'd earned the right to hunt alone." As he spoke, Ethelflaed's hands moved with practiced skill, sorting herbs. She had gathered before the storm, some familiar from her Saxon days, others unique to these northern slopes. She had proven herself many times over during their first months here, her healing knowledge blending with Norse wisdom to create something new and powerful. The hall's other inhabitants moved around them in the comfortable patterns of winter life. At the far end, Sigrid taught a mixed group of women the art of reading omens in spilled water, a Norse tradition that Ethelflaed had shown could work just as well with Saxon healing infusions. Near the main door, Guthrum's deep voice rose and fell as he taught young warriors songs of both peoples, his once bitter heart transformed by the very changes he had once fought. But the bear's greatest gift, Bjorn continued his tale, watching his son's rapt face. Wasn't its fur, or even its meat, that fed the hall through winter? It was the lesson it taught, that the fiercest things can become comfort if we approach them with wisdom and courage. Like Mother did, Edwin said softly, reaching up to touch Ethelflaed's face. When the scary men came, she made them better instead of afraid. Ethelflaed caught his small hand, pressing a kiss to it. We all learned that lesson, little one. Your father's people taught me that what we fear most sometimes becomes our greatest strength. The storm's voice rose outside, but it held no terror now. They had prepared well for this winter, the hall's stores full from both Norse hunting and Saxon herbcraft. Every family had warm furs, every child had food, and the songs that rose to the smoke-darkened beams spoke of both fjords and forests, of dragons and crosses, of old gods and new understanding. The bare fur remembers, Edwin murmured, already drifting back to sleep. Like the sunstone, like the ravens. Bjorn and Ethelflaed exchanged glances over their son's head. His gift for seeing connections, for finding wisdom in the spaces between their two worlds, grew stronger with each passing season. Sleep now, Ethelflaed whispered, drawing the fur closer. The bear watches over you, and all your father's and mother's gods besides. Later, as their son's breathing deepened into dreams, Bjorn pulled Ethelflaed close beneath the ancient fur. Her body fit against his, as naturally as sword to sheath, as bone to flesh, as one truth to another. When spring comes, he said softly, we'll add to your herb gardens. Sigrid says the southern slopes want Saxon wisdom as much as northern strength. And what do you want? She asked, though her smile suggested she knew. What I have, he replied simply, a hall that holds both. Our stories, a son who builds bridges with his words, and a love that proves the ravens knew best after all. The great fir held them close as the storm raged on, its ancient warmth protecting dreams that neither Saxon nor Norse had dreamed alone, but that grew possible in the sharing. The Saxon messenger's scroll lay unopened on the carved table, its leather binding marked with the seal of Ethelflaed's old settlement. Spring had brought more than just thawing fjords and returning birds. It had carried echoes of a past she had almost forgotten. Almost. Your brother lives, Bjorn said quietly, standing beside her as she stared at the scroll. He had recognized the messenger, a trader who moved between worlds as they did, carrying news and goods along the northern routes. He searches still. Ethelflaed's fingers brushed the silver rings that still hung at her neck, though now they shared space with Norse tokens of belonging. Sigrid's raven charm, a hammer of Thor that matched Bjorn's, tiny tokens of a life rebuilt from winter's ashes. Cuthbert always was stubborn, she said finally. Even when we were children, he never knew when to let go. She looked toward the hall's open door, where little Edwin played with the other children, his quiet wisdom now wrapped in childish laughter as they chased wooden boats through spring puddles. Will you read it? She picked up the scroll, feeling its weight. They cast us out into winter's teeth, left us to die. Her voice held no bitterness now, only a kind of wondering sadness. And now they write as if they have some claim. Perhaps they write to make peace, Bjorn suggested, though his hand had moved unconsciously to his sword hilt. Or perhaps they write because they've seen their error. The hall had grown quietly attentive, though everyone pretended to be absorbed in their tasks. Guthrum paused in teaching a young warrior the intricacies of shield repair. Sigrid's hands stilled on her healing herbs. Even the children's play seemed to soften, as if the very air held its breath. With deliberate movements, Ethelflaed broke the seal. The parchment crackled as she unrolled it, the familiar Saxon script strange now to eyes that had grown used. To Norse runes. To my sister, she read aloud, her voice steady. Word reached us of your survival, of your life among the Northmen. Some here call it tragedy, that you were taken by those we feared. But others whisper of healing magic that flows north now, of Saxon wisdom, teaching Norse hands to cure instead of kill. She paused, looking up at Bjorn. His face held the same steady strength that had first drawn her trust in that winter storm. So long ago. Father is dead, she continued, His last words were of you, of regret for choices made in fear. The settlement needs healing, sister, needs the wisdom that you've gained. Come home. The word hung in the air like frost. Home. But where was home now? Here in the hall, where her son spoke two tongues as naturally as breathing? Or back in the Saxon lands, where fear had once driven out love? There's more, she said softly. Your son, they say, is blessed by powers older than our quarrels. Some who once feared now wish to understand. The old wisdom fades in the south, while you make it flower in the north. Little Edwin had come inside, drawn perhaps by the change in atmosphere. He moved to stand between his parents, one hand reaching up to touch the scroll. The paper remembers sadness, he said in his quiet way, but it doesn't have to stay sad. Bjorn knelt beside his son. What do you see, little raven? Two paths, the boy said thoughtfully. One goes back, one goes forward. But maybe they're the same path, just seen from different ends? Aethelflaed felt something shift in her chest, like ice breaking up in spring rivers. The scroll in her hand seemed lighter somehow, its weight transforming from burden to bridge. Your brother speaks truth about one thing, Sigrid said, coming to stand beside them. The old wisdom lives stronger here because it flows both ways, like spring streams joining to make rivers. And rivers always find the sea, Guthrum added unexpectedly, no matter what mountains stand between. Aethelflaed looked around the hall, at the carved posts that told their story, at the herbs drying in Saxon patterns from Norse beams, at the children playing with toys that spoke of both worlds. Then she looked at Bjorn, whose love had shown her that strength could flow like healing instead of striking like lightning. Perhaps, she said slowly, there's another way to answer. Not going back, not staying hidden, but building something new, a bridge, like our son says. The scroll no longer seemed to carry the weight of the past, but rather the possibility of the future. Like the ravens that had led them together, it pointed toward paths yet unopened, stories yet untold. The wedding bands they forged together combined both worlds in metal and meaning. Saxon silver melted with Norse gold, patterns flowing into each other like joining streams. Bjorn's hands, calloused from sword and sea, worked beside Aethelflaed's healer's fingers as they shaped their answer to her brother's call. Not a return, she had explained to the hall gathering, but a reaching out. Not a choice between old home and new, but a weaving together. The rings would be their first gift to the Saxon settlement, a symbol of what was possible when fear gave way to understanding. The forge's heat turned their faces ruddy as they worked, little Edwin watching from a safe distance with Sigrid. The boy had grown tall enough now to help with simple tasks, his quiet wisdom wrapped in childhood's curiosity. See how the metals dance together, Bjorn showed him, lifting the crucible carefully. Like your mother's herbs and Sigrid's magic, different, powers becoming stronger in the joining. Like the words in my head, Edwin replied thoughtfully. Norse and Saxon, weaving stories neither could tell alone. Aethelflaed paused in her work, studying their son. At 5 winters old, he spoke both tongues with equal ease, but it was more than that. He spoke the language of in-between spaces, of bridges and possibilities that others might have missed. We'll send more than rings, she said, returning to her careful shaping of the cooling metal. We'll send knowledge, hope, a way forward that neither side could find alone. Bjorn nodded, understanding as always. They had spent many night watches discussing this, planning how to answer Cuthbert's letter. The rings were just the beginning. With them would go packets of herbs prepared in both traditions, healing scrolls that combined Saxon prayers with Norse runes, and most importantly, an invitation. Your brother writes of needing healing, he said, working a Norse protection knot into the surface of his ring. Perhaps healing flows both ways, like spring floods carrying new life to tired fields. Outside the forge, life in the hall continued, its comfortable rhythm. Guthrum's voice rose in song. A battle lay now turned to a teaching tale, its verses speaking of how strength could flow like water instead of striking like steel. Children's laughter mingled with the sound of women preparing medicines, their conversations switching easily between languages as need dictated. "I remember," Ethelflaed said softly, "how my father would sit in judgment, seeing threats in every shadow, dangers in every difference." She traced a Saxon cross pattern into her ring, but surrounded it with Norse knotwork. "He died afraid of what he didn't understand. I won't let fear write our story. What will you write instead?" Edwin asked, picking up a piece of cooled silver with careful fingers. "A new saga," Bjorn answered, sharing a look with his wife. "One that tells of bridges instead of walls, of how your mother's healing hands and Saxon wisdom made our hall stronger, not weaker, and of how your father's strength learned to protect instead of raid," Ethelflaed added. "Of how Guthrum's hatred turned to teaching, and Sigrid's magic grew richer with Saxon herbs. The rings took shape under their 4 hands, 2 large ones for wearing, and a smaller one that Edwin would carry south as their messenger. Each bore marks of both peoples, neither diminishing the other, both made stronger in the joining. Summer comes soon to the southern shores," Bjorn said as they worked. "Good sailing weather. Time enough to show your brother's people that change flows like spring rivers, unstoppable once it starts, but life-giving if we learn to swim with it. And if they fear still." Ethelflaed's hands never paused in their work, but old memories clouded her voice. "If they see only what they expect to see, then we show them something unexpected." Bjorn's smile held the confidence that had first won her trust in that winter storm. A Norse hall that welcomes Saxon wisdom, a Saxon healer who carries Thor's hammer, a child who speaks to ravens and builds bridges with his quiet words. Edwin held up the small ring he'd been studying. In its surface, somehow, he'd managed to trace a pattern that looked like flowing water, or perhaps like birds in flight. "The metal remembers everything it's been," he said in his thoughtful way, "but it's happy to become something new." Ethelflaed gathered her son close with one arm, her other hand still working the cooling metal. "Out of the mouths of children," she murmured in Saxon, then repeated it in Norse. "Out of the space between worlds," Bjorn corrected gently, adding the final touches to his ring, "where all new stories start." Together, they held up their work to the forge light. 3 rings that spoke of endings transformed to beginnings, of barriers becoming bridges, of love that flowed stronger than fear. Tomorrow they would begin preparing for the journey south, but tonight they would celebrate what they had forged, in metal and in meaning. The family tapestry taking shape under Sigrid's skilled hands told a story never before woven into Norse threads. Its pattern spoke of Saxon crosses flowing into Norse knots, of ravens carrying healing herbs in their beaks, of a mother and child saved by winter storms rather than destroyed by them. Each evening, as the hall settled into its comfortable rhythms, she added more to the telling. "See here," she showed Edwin, who watched the weaving with his characteristic quiet intensity, "how your mother's healing signs twine with your father's warrior marks. Like dancers who start apart, but find their way together." The boy traced the patterns with careful fingers. At 6 winters old, he moved easily between the hall's many roles, sometimes helping Ethelflaed prepare her medicines, other times listening to Bjorn's tales of navigation by star and stone, often simply watching as 2 peoples became something new together. "The threads remember both stories," he said, touching where Saxon red met Norse blue, "like the rings we sent south." Word had come back from Cuthbert's settlement, tentative at first, then growing stronger with each trading ship. The rings had caused much discussion, their mixed metalwork speaking louder than words of what was possible when old fears gave way to new understanding. "More boats come from the south now," Bjorn observed, joining them at the weaving frame, bringing more than just trade goods. Indeed, the hall had begun hosting Saxon healers who came to learn Norse methods, while young Norse warriors sought to understand Saxon herb lore. What had started as a trickle was becoming a stream of knowledge flowing both ways across the sea. Ethelflaed looked up from where she worked with a mixed group of students, Norse and Saxon both, teaching them how to bind wounds with prayers from both traditions. "They come because they're ready to learn," she said, "as we were ready to learn from each other." The tapestry showed this too. Figures of both peoples gathering around shared fires, boats carrying medicine instead of weapons, children playing games that spoke of both worlds. Sigrid's clever fingers had even captured little Edwin's particular magic, showing him surrounded by ravens while joining hands with both peoples. "Tell me again," Edwin requested, settling into his favorite spot between his parents, "about the storm that brought us together." "Ah, but which storm?" Bjorn smiled, touching his raven pendant. "The one outside that drove us together, or the one inside that kept us apart until we learned better?" "Both," the boy said firmly. "All the storms. They're part of the same story, aren't they?" Ethelflaed gathered her son close, her fingers still stained with the herbs she'd been preparing. "Yes, little raven. Like this tapestry, each thread matters, even the dark ones, perhaps especially the dark ones, for they help us see the light more clearly." The hall's great doors stood open to the spring evening, carrying the scent of both. Saxon and Norse herbs growing together in the gardens Ethelflaed had established. Young voices carried on the breeze, children playing games that mixed both cultures' tales, creating new stories as naturally as breathing. "Your brother writes again," Bjorn said softly to his wife. "Speaks of more families wanting to make the journey north when summer comes, not to flee this time, but to learn, to share. And some of our young ones speak of sailing south," Sigrid added, her fingers never ceasing their work on the tapestry. "Not to raid, but to teach, to heal," she smiled at Edwin, "to build more bridges like our little raven here." The boy touched the tapestry again, finding the place where his own figure stood between worlds. "The threads want to go both ways," he observed, "like rivers flowing to the sea and rain falling back to earth." Ethelflaed and Bjorn exchanged glances over their son's head, seeing in him the future they had barely dared to hope for in that long-ago winter storm. He was neither fully Saxon nor fully Norse, but something new, a bridge builder, a healer of ancient wounds, a weaver of new patterns. "That's why we're all here, isn't it?" Edwin continued thoughtfully. "Not to choose one way over another, but to find new ways together?" "Out of the mouths of children," Bjorn murmured in Saxon, while Ethelflaed repeated it in Norse, and Sigrid's fingers wove both words into her tapestry. Another bridge built, another wall transformed into a doorway. Outside, the spring sun set slowly over the fjord, painting the sky in colors that belonged to no one people, but spoke to all. Inside, the tapestry grew longer, telling a story of fear transformed to understanding, of strength flowing like healing instead of striking, like steel, of love that built bridges across the coldest winters of the heart. The small prayer book resting on Edwin's lap contained wisdom from both worlds, its pages illuminated with Norse runes and Saxon script flowing together like intertwined streams. At 7 winters old, he had begun recording the prayers and healing wisdom of both peoples, his careful hand capturing the knowledge that flowed through their hall like spring waters. "Both tongues remember the same truths," he explained too. The latest group of visitors, a mixture of Saxon healers and Norse wisdom keepers who had traveled far to share in what their hall had built. The old powers speak through many voices, but their healing remains one. Ethelflaed and Bjorn watched from the high seat their people had insisted they take, their fingers intertwined like the mixed metals of their rings. The hall had grown, in ways neither could have imagined in that desperate winter storm, not just in size, but in purpose. What had begun as survival had become transformation. "Your son speaks with raven's wisdom," one of the Saxon healers observed, wonder replacing old fear in her voice. "The stories reached us in the south, but seeing," she shook her head, "seeing is believing." "He speaks with the wisdom of both peoples," Bjorn corrected gently, touching his raven pendant, "as we all must learn to do if we're to build something stronger than our old fears." The prayer book's pages turned, revealing medicines that combined Saxon herbs with Norse ritual, healing chants that wove both tongues into something more powerful than either alone. Like the tapestry hanging behind them, like the garden growing both people's plants together, like the children playing in the yard beyond, everything spoke of bridges built, of walls transformed into doorways. We are all one people under the old powers, Edwin read from his book, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had once been silence. Saxon and Norse, south and north, all rivers leading to the same sea. Ethelflaed squeezed Bjorn's hand, remembering a frozen night when trust had seemed impossible, when love had seemed an unlikely answer to hatred's ancient questions. Now their hall stood as living proof that different streams could join to form, mighty rivers that strength could flow like healing instead of striking like steel. The last light of day painted the fjord, in colors that belonged to no one people but spoke to all, while ravens wheeled overhead, watching the new world they had helped to build. Inside the hall, voices rose in songs that mixed both tongues, telling the story of a woman and child saved by love's courage, of a warrior who learned that true strength flows like spring rivers, and of a boy who helped build bridges across the winters of the heart. And if the old gods and new smiled down on this gathering, they saw what mortal eyes sometimes missed, that love's wisdom, like water, always finds its way through stone, transforming walls into bridges, turning endings into new beginnings, making all things possible for those with courage to dream and strength to build.